Hey, what's up, everyone? What's up, everybody? Koku here. We're about to start the show. Well, just want to give you a little heads up of what we're doing. We're continuing the reading from last week. So last week we read African Cultural Continuity and Slave Revolts in the New World, Part 1 by Dr. John Henrik Clarke. We're reading Part 2, the conclusion tonight. So I want to thank you guys for tuning in once again. I want to thank you guys for tuning in on Saturday night. Saturday night Shoot the Breeze was awesome. And I look forward to you guys tuning in on Thursday when I do the Thursday Thoughts segment of the Bitter Medicine podcast over on the KWAZ radio YouTube channel. So I look forward to seeing you guys over there as well. So we're going to continue this tonight. It's a short paper, to be honest. Hopefully you guys will join and drop comments, and we could have a fuller conversation around this paper. And as always, you guys can always leave comments after the live stream has ended. Leave a comment, and we can continue the conversation there. Make sure to click the link and join the Discord so we can have more conversations, do more things. And with that being said, let us start the show, actually.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine podcast on KWAZ Radio. Welcome to the Bitter Medicine podcast, where it's all about Black empowerment. Our show focuses on Black news and entertainment, arts, science, economics, history, people, and strategies that uplift, empower, and motivate Africans within the diaspora. And now your host, whose favorite color is black, Goku.
Welcome back to the Bitter Medicine podcast. I am your host, Koku. Just want to remind you guys before we get the show rolling that this show is part of a podcast network called KWAZ Radio. There are other shows on the network you are invited to tune into.
This is W.E.B with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-Black perspective, where Black problems are addressed with Black solutions.
Greetings, fam. Tune in to The Learning Curve with me, the Revolutionary Matron on KWAZ Radio.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Yes, indeed. Welcome back to the Bitter Medicine podcast. I appreciate all of you that are tuning in. I see Oni is in the chat saying peace. Peace to Oni. Make sure you guys check out his latest episode of the Pro-Black Perspective. He's doing these segments lately on the enemies within. So make sure you guys are tuning in to the Pro-Black Perspective. The last show he did on Sunday was pretty informative and entertaining, so you guys should tune in. Make sure you guys have checked out the last episode of the Harsh Reality Podcast Presents. Real good. I was supposed to drop a comment on that today. Real good conversation there as well. So make sure you tune into that show. And as always, make sure you guys shout out the Revolutionary Matron as well. So let's get to this reading. Again, thank you guys for tuning in. This is going to be a pretty quick show. It should be a quick show. African Cultural Continuity and Slave Revolts in the New World, Part 2, the conclusion. And this is a paper by Dr. John Henrik Clarke. The dilemma of being in the slave trade and wanting to be still considered a Christian nation bothered the conscience of most European nations until they developed a rationale to relieve themselves. Spain was no different. During the closing years of his reign, Charles V of Spain turned against the principle of slavery for Indians or Africans. In 1542, he issued a code for the protection of the Amerindians of Spanish America and directed that all African slaves be set free. This bold, quote-unquote, Christian act alarmed all of the European nations in the slave trade, and the mental condition of King Charles was open to question by the merchants who had invested so heavily in the trade. An official, Pedro de la Casca, was sent to carry this surprising emancipation order into effect. After a year, the pro-slavery forces in Spain prevailed, and King Charles was retired to the monastery of Yuste in 1558, and the slave trade resumed in the Spanish colonies. That says a lot, by the way. That says a lot. They even went against the thinking of their quote unquote king. That's how ravenous these folks were to keep slavery going. The Spanish continued to give lip service to the theory that the slave trade was an unchristian and illegal procedure in their policy, and to engage in it required a special assent or asiento of the Spanish sovereign. In the course of time, the asiento became a shield or rationale behind which the Spanish could be quote-unquote Christians and engage in the slave trade at the same time. This asiento became a contract for supplying the Spanish Indies with slaves. Sometimes the contractors of the asiento passed on a portion of their privilege to subcontractors. This is how the British made their initial entry into the slave trade. In 1562, a British sea captain, John Hawkins, later Sir John, took a contract for the supply of slaves from Guinea to the Canary Islands or directly to the Caribbean islands. In 1564, his participation in this enterprise was sanctioned by Queen Elizabeth, who invested some of her personal fortune in the slave trade. She lent him one of her ships, ironically named the good ship Jesus. Captain Hawkins expanded his interests and his skill in slave trading and took over the contracts in some of his original sponsors and drove them out of the business. He laid a foundation for eventual British domination over the slave trade. Previous to this time, Spanish slave trading depots were scattered along the west coast of Africa. Slave revolts in the Spanish Caribbean and in the Spanish colonies in South America continued. Sometimes the methods of putting down the revolts were more expensive than the revolts themselves. In Cuba and in St. Dominique, there were hundreds of African slaves who came from the same general area in Africa and who often belonged to the same African ethnic group. Here again, African cultural continuity helped to foment and to sustain a number of successful slave revolts. These revolts created an extremely unstable slave system. In the parts of the New World dominated by the Portuguese, the situation differed only by degree. The Portuguese, who literally started the European slave trade, first brought Africans to work in Europe. The Spanish were the first to transport Africans to America as a labor force. The Portuguese made a claim in Brazil during the last year of the 15th century. This claim was legitimized by the Treaty of Tordesillas. The Portuguese did not at this time have the labor force to develop this vast territory. By 1531, they had assembled the labor force that they needed. This labor force consisted of Portuguese immigrants, Amerindians, and Africans. The first Africans were from the Congo, Dahomey, Lagos, and Old Calabar in Nigeria. Quote, without slaves from Africa, end of quote, reported on an early Portuguese source, it is impossible to do anything in Brazil. According to R.K. Kent in his article Palmeiras, an African state in Brazil, in 1965, the first known landing of slaves from Africa on Brazilian soil took place in 1552. In 1580, on the eve of Brazil's sugar boom, there were no fewer than 10,000 Africans in Brazil. This number began to increase rapidly during the last years of the 16th century. This sugar-based economy could not have maintained itself without the Africans' labor on the plantations and the Africans as soldiers defending Brazil from other slave trading European powers who made claims in this territory. Again, we're reminded of our participation in this stuff, right? We got Bobby E. Wright in the chat saying Habarigani, or peace to you, Bobby E. Wright. Thanks for coming through, right? But we have to be mindful of our participation, even today, in this system. In Brazil, some Africans worked for the Portuguese, some worked against them, and others ran away from the towns and the plantations and established purely African states, mainly Palmeiras and Bahia. These states and their fight to survive represent the best example of African cultural continuity in the New World. There were 9 revolts in Bahia between 1807 and 1835. That's impressive, right? You're talking in a 30-year period. You had 9 revolts. That's, kudos to them. These revolts involved several African culture groups, such as the Hausa, Yoruba, Kwa-speaking groups, as well as the Ogboni Society, Muslim Glufas, and a forerunner of the Back to Africa movement. Interesting. Okay. The Portuguese declared total war against these communities of escaped slaves. These wars lasted for more than 100 years. According to an assessment by R.K. Kent, nothing, however, in the annals of Brazilian history compares with the Negro Republic of Palmeiras in Pernambuco. It spanned almost the entire 17th century. Between 1672 and 1692, it withstood, on the average, 1 Portuguese expedition every 15 months. In the last entrada against Palmeiras, a force of 6,000 took part in 42 days of siege. Palmeiras was Brazil's classic Colombo on slave settlement. Early writers on Brazilian attributed the establishment of this slave state to the Portuguese-Dutch rivalry over Pernambuco, from which slaves profited by escaping in groups. Okay. The site of this unusual slave community was in a mountainous region that became a natural fortress for its inhabitants. The many fruit trees gave easy sustenance to those who knew where they were. The timber-yielding trees served various industrial uses. In time, the Africans made this a self-contained community. They declared some of the forests and developed small farms. This, with fishing and hunting, made their food supply ample. The other day, Oni was talking about the enemies within, but he said something that's very interesting that I think a lot of people take for granted, especially in first world countries. A lot of Africans in particular in these first world countries take it for granted that you eat 3 times a day, but you don't actively participate in this food production. And that's problematic for people too. It's problematic for folks to have full stomachs but aren't really participant in how this food is harvested, produced, etc. And I think that's something that we need to shake off of us, and shoot the breeze a few weeks ago, maybe a month ago, We talked about a black man. We showed this video, great video of a black man dealing in hydroponics. And, you know, that's something we need to kind of invest in our communities, wherever we are, be it in the Caribbean, here in America, in the UK. We need to start understanding food production more and understanding what it takes to feed, say, 1,000 people, right? Or if you want to go small, say 100 people, 10 people, or whatever, because you'll have to understand the scale, right? And we don't really understand that. And that's a shame. That's a shame. And our enemies have some ideas about these things. Our enemies actually deal in rooftop gardens and community gardens and all this kind of stuff. But they do that stuff, and you know, maybe a Black equals African person or two is around it when it happens. But they really control that. They organize that stuff. We have to start organizing these types of things ourselves. We have to understand how to feed ourselves, you know, even based on what we just read here, right? Our ancestors in Brazil, our maroon ancestors in several different parts of the Caribbean actually understood how to etch out a life. These guys, and you know, that was one of the things that I guess you could say was advantageous, but even before they were enslaved people in Africa, they were taking care of stuff. They were farming. And as Black equals African folks today, we have to be very careful of being just consumers. I think it's Amos Wilson who's to talk about it all the time. Like, we gotta stop just being consumers, man, and start understanding what it takes to feed ourselves, you know. And again, your ancestors understood it. Your ancestors were in the practice of doing it. So when they ran off, they didn't have to necessarily run back to these folks again, their enemies, just to be fed. The way things are right now, the majority of Black folks, say here in America, would have to run back to their enemy and be fed. Think about that. Think about that, you know, to continue. The Portuguese did not quietly sit by and permit the continuous existence of Palmares. 15 expeditions were sent against the Republic, including that of Zenobio Ascioli de Vasconcelos, I guess, in 1667. And this other guy, Velho, together with Sebastian Diaz and Bernardo Vieira de Mello in 1695. In campaigns against Palmares that lasted over 50 years, it is possible that other unrecorded expeditions were sent against Palmares. The settlers created a government using what they remembered from Africa. You see, let me finish the sentence here. The settlers created a government using what they remembered from Africa and what they had learned since their arrival in Brazil. Murder, adultery, stealing, and desertion demanded death as a penalty. And see, this is what I'm talking about. This is what I'm talking about. We explain away and make excuses for the friendly fire that happens in our communities, when in reality we can't really we shouldn't be allowing so much friendly fire. Things are going to happen. There's going to be some bad things that happen in the community. That's a human thing. I'm not talking about just the human nature and the things that can happen from there. I'm talking about this other extra shit that goes on. right? That people will say, well, it's white supremacy's fault. Like, we have to be better. We have to control ourselves. We have to govern ourselves. And I'm not necessarily talking about formal governments in another man's country, especially, but I'm talking about we. You know, a lot of people will call this the code and all this kind of stuff, but we're supposed to carry ourselves a certain way. We're supposed to be actively trying to remember, you know, our former African, Black equals African selves. Pick up one or two things that you learn from being around these other people, but make sure you have rules like ma'at, laws for how you carry yourself. Let me read that last line again. When these ancestors were running off, revolting, fighting, holding land, and creating communities, right? These guys said murder, adultery, stealing, and desertion demanded death as a penalty. And we shouldn't be no less than our ancestors. We should be more, right? We should be more. In the chat, Bobby Wright says, my grandfather was a country boy. So when I was growing up, we had a garden in the backyard with different vegetables. Absolutely. Bobby Wright, where are you from exactly? Are you from the U.S.? If so, what part? I'm just curious. Yeah, I grew up, I tell people this all the time. I've lived like a whole different life one time ago. I grew up in a yard where I had to pick up eggs from chicken nests. I had to grab chickens, right? On weekends, I went with my uncle. We went down to the farm where we had pigs. We had pigeon peas, cassava, okra. We had mangoes. We had corn. You know, we had all these different things to mine. And so we knew where our food was coming from. We still did some grocery shopping. You know, my grandmother raised me. So yeah, she still did some grocery shopping. Bobby Wright says he's from Louisiana. Thanks for letting me know that, Bobby. That's a nice place to be from. All right. The pro-Black perspective says we used to govern ourselves. We used to govern ourselves. There was a time when we were feeding ourselves. We were working the land. We had animals, etc. Bobby Wright just said it right here. They had chickens and turkeys. So he knows what I'm talking about. I know what it is to tote water. I know what it is to go to a well and have to use a hand pump and prime a pump, and because maybe you haven't used the well in a while. I know what it is to have to prime a pump. I also know what it is to have to drop a bucket down in a well and pull up water. When y'all see images of our family on the continent toting stuff on their head or toting stuff with a crossbar across their back, we knew about that. Many of us, not all in the Caribbean, because some people were more modernized or what have you, and they went away from such things. But even some of those people knew what it was to buy fresh pigeon peas, to buy fresh corn, to buy a mango or two if they didn't have a mango tree in their yard. Like, we used to take care of shit, man. And what we've done, especially in America, what our Black equals African folks in America have done, we've gone to these cities now because that's where you could find a job. But if you listen to a guy like W.E.B and stuff who's out there in Jacksonville, you could get out of those cities. You could get an hour and a half away from a city and actually have land and farm. And, you know, that brother that we talked about during Shoot the Breeze about a month ago, that's a great story. Even though you're in these cities, you could get into aquaponics. You could get into urban farming. You should at least have an idea how this stuff is done. even if you don't live it every day. Have an idea. Bobby Wright knows how to deal with some farm animals. He knows how to go in a garden and do some stuff. That's all I'm saying. Like, we gotta be better. You know, I'm especially gonna say that to Caribbean folks. Like, Caribbean folks come to the States and start living like folks live stateside and forget about all that kind of stuff. Instead of teaching the kids that they have here and stuff like that about those things again, get out in that land. We used to grow up back home walking barefoot. We had hard foot bottom and all that, you know, hard feet on the bottom. Now we're living soft. We're just going and buying pre-made food already cooked, or we go put some stuff in the freezer, but we don't know where that came from. We don't know what the chemicals were, you know, in the food and the mash and all that stuff that they're feeding these chickens and these hogs and whatever. We have no idea. We're completely dependent on these people. And like Sankara said, who feeds you controls you. You want to get back some of that control. And look at these ancestors and understood that. By the way, they could have gone back because, again, some people deserted. Clearly, some people deserted. And them folks, like only just said, we govern ourselves. Them guys had a rule like, yo, that shit demands death as a penalty. All this stealing that we see going on in our communities now, killing one another, these guys said death to that stuff. To continue, North American historians, with few exceptions, have ignored the long tradition of resistance to slavery that the Africans established in South America and in the Caribbean islands. They contend that the slave seldom revolted, and when he did, his motive was more hatred of the whites than a desire for freedom. Any serious study of the states of Bahia and Palmares and Brazil alone would contradict this point of view. The Africans' negative defense reaction to slavery was expressed again as they fled to the forests, the mountains, and those places that promise asylum. These runaway slaves, called Maroons, established communities in Canada, Cuba, Dutch Guyana, Jamaica, and Mexico. The Republic of Palmares, famous in the history of Brazil for more than 50 years of resistance from 1630 to 1697, is an outstanding example of what I mean. And by the way, you guys remind me to, because someone mentioned in a comment on one of the videos that I should look at, you know, like South American resistance, you know, Africans in South America and their resistance. And I think that's something I need to talk about more too. You know, we let this language stuff be a barrier to us. Like, okay, those are Spanish speaking or Portuguese or whatever. You know, we have to stop that too. There's something to learn from all of it. That's why I talk about this education thing, and it needs to be like a Pan-African education. There's something to learn from all sectors of Black equals African global society. To continue, in Brazil, these revolts started in the 16th century, resulted after a long process of evolution and a changed public opinion and more concern for the welfare of the Africans. This was followed by the establishment of the Brazilian abolitionist movement. There were several competing slave systems in South America and the Caribbean islands. Important, though sometimes neglected by historians on the subject, is the slave system started by the Dutch and the nature of resistance to the system. According to Sir Harry H. Johnston, the Dutch were hard taskmasters. As slaveholders, they were disliked more than the British or the British Americans. They threw themselves into the slave trade and the establishment of slave-worked plantations with a zest exceeding that of any other nationality. Interesting. You know, you got to watch the Dutch now with a heavy side eye. The Dutch established their first South American colonies in Guyana and in northern Brazil. African reaction to the harsh Dutch rule started on the Dutch ships bringing them from Africa. The best-known slave revolts against the Dutch are the Revolt of the Suriname Maroons, 1715 to 1763, and the Berbice Revolt in 1763. We talked about Berbice in another John Henrik Clarke paper we did about 3 weeks ago, so you can look that up. These revolts threatened the very foundation of the economy based on slavery. The pattern of revolt differed only by degree in the Caribbean islands. It can be said with almost absolute justification that these revolts and the personalities involved were the Caribbean and South American antecedents of the 12th century New World Black Radical. The present-day resistance movements among Blacks in South America and the Caribbean and in the United States can best be understood against this historical background. You see, that's why I personally have a disdain for the whole ADOS FBA thing. Number one, folks were moving back and forth. It was understood at one time there was a relation or relationships between the Caribbean islands, the Americas, South America, right? And also, as this paper just suggests right here, we learn from one another. You understand? We learn from one another. We understood that the resistance that happened in South America was related to us, right? When you see guys like Kwame Ture, formerly Stokely Carmichael, right? When you see CLR James and you see all these different folks, even Eric Williams from Trinidad, prime minister, right? When you see those folks come about, these folks are, they come about because they come from people that were around during these times. And that spirit of revolution, that Black radical was in them from these type of events that we're talking about in this paper right now. You have to respect that. And those guys came, like a Stokely, like a Kwame Ture, came to America with that kind of fire. And to see folks in America, and again, of course, Marcus Garvey and stuff, and to see folks now talking shit about those guys, it's crazy to me. It's crazy to me. In an article, quote unquote, A Birth of Freedom, by the Ghanaian writer Sidney King, also known as Iusi Kwayana, Special Guyana Independence Issue. This point is graphically made when he reminds us that the Caribbean tradition, taken as a whole, is a revolutionary tradition. It is the stage on which acted Cudjoe and Kufi, right? Akabra and Accra, Toussaint, Kwamina, and Damon, Ado, and Arabi, all leaders of slave revolts. Blows delivered against the European system in 1750 or in 1850 served to shake that system, sometimes to its foundations, and to cause it to make democratic concessions as a price of recovery. It was never the same again, and although financial exploitation became more intense and complicated, a constitutional superstructure was raised for dealing with human anger and for sidetracking revolution into peaceful, awe-inspiring chambers. You know, again, just to go back to this ADOS FBA stuff again, you know, recently, one of the things that these folks are doing, and Yvette Carnell picked up on it and started to spread it as well, is that they say that the Haitian Revolution actually extended slavery or expanded slavery in the Americas. So I guess their mindset was, you know, their mindset is actually today kudos to Haiti, but let's not act like it benefited us in any way. And that stuff is vexing, man. It's disrespectful at that, too. The revolts referred to here were epitomized by the Berbice Revolution of 1763. This revolt, Sidney King observed, struck the first blow for Guyanese independence. It was a blow that the theoreticians of human subjugation will never forget. It was part and parcel of the Caribbean movement, begun by the Caribs against European penetration and domination. While deploring the fact that this revolution has received scant treatment in the bulk of West Indian literature, Sidney King states that the purpose of this essay is to restore the Berbice Revolution to its proper context, not only in West Indian and Caribbean history, but in world history. He further maintains that it will be found that many of the initiatives for human freedom, credit for which has been claimed by the well-publicized and advertised revolutions, which were not without great merit, were in fact foreshadowed in Berbice. So he's talking about like the Haitian Revolution and whatnot, right? You have to put respect on that stuff. Bobby Wright says the FBA ADOS clowns don't remember that a majority of their ancestors came from Africa via the Caribbean where the slave breaking islands, Jamaica, Barbados, Cuba, etc. Absolutely. The essence of the Berbice slave rebellion and how it started is this. From time to time, the Africans not only escaped their cruel masters, but they killed them before doing so. These killings are spoken of as rebellions, and scores of them are recorded. But there was one rebellion that was more than a mere attempt to throw off the yoke of slavery, for it had in it the germ of a revolution. We refer to the Berbice slave rebellion. Cuffy, the leader of the rebellion, was a house slave who had been brought to the colony very young, and because of his intelligence, he had been taught coopering by this master. When the rebellion started in February 1763 at Magdalenenburg on Kanji, Kufi was there from the start, but he was angry at it. He had hoped to secure better conditions for the slaves without having to resort to war, but this was not to be so. Ironically, while the slaves were rebelling, the governor of Berbice was putting a plea for them to the directors of the association. When he heard the news of the rising, he did not hesitate to send what help he could to the planters on Kanji. So like I've said to you guys before, one of the things you'll find with Dr. John Henrik Clarke's writings is that he essentially kind of reuses prior writings. And so this might sound very familiar to you based on that, that whole paper that we read on the Berbice insurrection, right? By the beginning of March, the rebellion had spread to the Berbice River, where the first plantations to be attacked were those of certain private planters who had been extremely cruel to their slaves. Plantation after plantation was overrun, and the whites captured and killed. Meanwhile, the whites had rushed for all the places of safety. They took refuge in a brick house at Peerboom. The whites had turned the house into a virtual fortress, each window being defended and the approaches strewn with broken glass. But this did not deter the Africans, who bombarded the building with hobnails, bounded round with burning cotton. Okay. Soon the roof was afire, but as this was quickly extinguished, Kosala, the leader of their attack, told the whites that the Africans were determined to take the estate. The whites held a hasty council. They knew the governor of Berbice had planned sending a recently arrived slave ship to cover with his guns their retreat to the river. Right. By the way, this shows you something too. These slave ships were armed. So all that resistance that our ancestors did on these slave ships, they did that in spite of the armaments on these ships. But the ship was nowhere in sight, and provisions and water were running out. The manager of one of the estates spoke to the Africans. He asked why they were treating the Christians in that manner. Kosala's reply was virtually a declaration of independence. He said that the Christians were too cruel, and that they had decided that they would not tolerate any more Christians or whites in their country. Further, that they intended to be masters of Berbers since all the plantations belonged to them. For a summary of the significance of the Berbers rebellion and its place in world history, I go back to the article by Sidney King. He says, the Berbers slave rebellion, as it is mistakenly called, was an episode in the 18th century of worldwide historic significance. To be of worldwide historic significance, an episode needs only to present new historical aspects that are in the same time qualitatively important. West Indian activities cannot afford to pay obeisance to humanity. And so we are best fitted to redefine historical magnitude. Numbers, then, are not of first importance. It is sufficient that there is new historical precedent. A small number of human agents in a human drama can conceivably do something that has not taken place before, something astonishing to informed observers. This was the case with 1763. And King makes an interesting point there, man. Let me tell you something. If you were enslaved and you got together 5 other enslaved people, and together y'all took out 15, what they call what Clarke is calling planters, you took out these so-called slave masters, you did good. You did good. You took out 5 and it was 3, you did good. And there's something to be learned from your actions too. You gotta understand, man. To not have military experience but carry out military-like hits, you gotta give our ancestors credit. The rising of 1763 took place before the revolt of the American colonies in North America, known to history as the original type of colonial revolution and the forerunner of modern republicanism. It took place before the Haitian Revolution, which fulfilled some of the aims of Berbers. It happened 100 years before the Paris Commune, 150 years before the October Socialist Revolution in bourgeoisie Russia, and nearly 250 years before the launching of the Cuban Perpetual Revolution. It contains an embryo features of all these revolutions, and it foreshadowed, as so many other risings have done, some of Lenin's revolutionary principles. On the other hand, it came after the Jamaican Maroon and the Suriname, quote-unquote, Bush Negro movements, and aimed at carrying these to their logical conclusion. Before we continue with the rest of the paper here, let me pause here for a station ID break. I'm happy for those of you who tuned in tonight. I'm happy for those of you who have dropped comments, as Bobby E. Wright, Pro-Black Perspective. And I hope those of you who come across this episode later on will continue to drop comments down in the comment section, right? Let's do a station ID break. On the other side, we'll finish off the rest of the paper.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is W.E.B with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the Pro-Black Perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
Greetings, fam. Tune in to The Learning Curve with me, the Revolutionary Matron on KWAZ Radio.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Have you ever considered joining KWAZ Radio? Each of our hosts shares their unique perspective with you. You might have a perspective that needs to be shared. If that's true, hit us up at kwaz.radio@gmail.com. What are you gonna do? What you gonna do?
What are you gonna do? I know what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna continue and complete the reading of this paper. But if you want to join KWAZ Radio, you just got the instructions you need. By the way, let me say this too. There's a lot of you who are, usual listeners of, and you're there for Shoot the Breeze. When I drop those links, some of you guys can, any one of you guys can hop on, right? You don't need for me to point you out. Just hop on, and you can share your thoughts on those discussions as well. To continue, the closeness in time of the Berbers rising to the Bush Negroes movement in Suriname and Jamaica, to the revolutions in Haiti and North America, reminds us that it took place in a period of world convulsions, when the established order stood in jeopardy every hour, apparently to remain so eternally. The spirit of man, after the refinement of the resistance and the nationalism and heresy of the Reformation, had been made extremely vigilant by the self-centered individualism of the bourgeoisie. Now it was in quest of liberation. So it was too in the West Indies, a mainspring of the Industrial Revolution. The War of the Maroons of Jamaica predated the Berbers' rebellion and is better known in history. The word Maroons once spread terror along the skirts of the Blue Mountains of Jamaica. There were times when they swept down unsuspectedly upon the outlying European plantations, started the assembly from its order, and according to an official statement of the day, endangered public credit, civil rights, and the prosperity, if not the very existence of the island colony of Jamaica. The Maroons have been compared to the European rebels called the Circassians. The difference is that while the white mountaineers numbered 400,000 and only declared and only defied Tsar Nicholas of Russia, the black mountaineers numbered less than 2,000 and defied Cromwell of England. The Circassians, after years of revolt, were finally subdued. The Maroons, on the other hand, whose revolt started in 1655, were never completely conquered. Now, we talked about some things that the Maroons did that's kind of bogus, but yeah. The events that led to the Maroon Rebellion are only briefly outlined here. The African slaves in Jamaica, under the leadership of a man named Cudjoe, who is better known in history as Captain Cudjoe, had withdrawn from a fortified citadel manned by the Europeans and had begun to harass the people in this fortress with spasmodic attacks. This first Maroon War came about because the English had begun to betray the promises previously made to the Maroons and were now encroaching on their territory. The English had made concessions to the Maroons as a reward for their alliance against the Spanish. In the protracted wars that followed, the Maroons distinguished themselves as a military power, but accepted a settlement that was less than independence. We talked about this in the past. The settlement that is still being questioned by some Caribbean historians gave the Maroons internal autonomy while making them, quote unquote, responsible directly to the governor of Jamaica. The Ghanaian writer Sidney King appraises the effects of the settlement and the impact of the Maroons in this way. He says, the Maroons, therefore, seem to lack a total conception of liberty, which could rally all the oppressed in the island for an assault on the slaveholders' power. They were willing to buy a limited freedom by pledging in advance the liberty of their fellows. We can be excused for thinking of them at this level as a little aristocratic, as a material interest. Nevertheless, the Maroon movement was a mighty contribution to the West Indian and to world freedom, but it lacked the indispensable guarantee of national sovereignty. The Maroons were a people, a remarkable people, but not a nation, and they did not set up a state. Yet without them, Berbers could not have taken place. So you see, that's why I always say, even great people can be inconsistent. Even great folks can be inconsistent. You might, like, they just recently, I guess, celebrated or remember, in remembrance of Malcolm X's assassination. Like, Malcolm X was great, but he had a flaw, which was his religion. Which was his dedication to some of these religious figures. But you don't throw away Malcolm. And there's others who are like that too. But you don't throw them away. You don't throw away the Maroons because what they did contributed. You understand? Now, what we got to do is not make the same mistakes. You see, that's, again, I have to bring them up. That's what most Black equals African folks are doing today. That's what's happening here in the States. People are fooling themselves with this nation within a nation talk. And instead, they want to come to some agreements and this, that, and the other. But if it ain't about nation, it ain't about nothing. And that's what we have to learn from this stuff. If it ain't about nation, the shit ain't about nothing. The Revolt of the Maroons. Did I finish reading this? No. What is called the Bush... where was I? Yeah, what is called the Bush Negro Movement of Suriname, or Dutch Guyana, has a closer relationship to the Maroon movement than to the Berbers movement of 1763. In their cause and in the way they executed their battle strategy by withdrawing from the European-dominated plantations, they related directly to the Maroons. In fact, they are referred to as the Maroons of Suriname. Both of these movements used some of the same tactics, though the Suriname movement was not as effective. These movements were pre-nationalist in their aims and scope. In general, they were freedom movements that, given time, would have developed into autonomous Black states. I don't know if you could just assume that. The Maroons in Jamaica didn't become a state. There was no statehood there. In Suriname, some of the Africans who had been brought into this country at an earlier date had escaped into the wooded hinterlands and had established independent communities. These communities became havens for other Africans who escaped from the European-controlled plantations. This situation, in part, helped to set the Suriname Revolt in motion. The first open outbreak occurred in 1726 when the slaves on the plantations on the Siramika River revolted. After the government found it impossible to subdue these rebels, they tortured 11 captives to death, thinking that this would frighten the other rebels into submission. This act of cruelty only made the rebellion spread into other areas. That's how dumb these Europeans are. It would continue for almost another generation. One of the leaders of the rebellion, named Addo, signed a peace treaty in 1749. In 1761, when the Suriname rebels were under the leadership of two Black generals referred to as Captain Arabi and Captain Baston, another treaty was signed. The plantation owners did not seem to have learned anything by their past experience. They did not feel called on to honor any of the treaties and they had made with the blacks. In 1722, another leader named Barron led the Suriname Maroons in another uprising. Some of the planters liberated their slaves and used them against the rebels. This was only partially successful. In increasing numbers, the quote-unquote liberated slaves joined the rebels. These wars lasted until 1831. Let me ask you guys this question. Should I ask this question? Let me ask this question. If you're there, you could answer. If the U.S. government gave quote-unquote liberation to ADOS and FBA to fight against continental Africans and to fight against continental Africa, how many ADOS FBA do you think, quote-unquote liberated, would actually defect and go on the side of continental Africa? I'm just curious to hear what you guys think. All right. If you're here live and you want to answer, post your response. I'll read it live on air. The revolt of the Maroons, both in Jamaica and in Suriname, helped to create the condition and attitude that made the Berbice revolt in Guyana possible. These revolts, collectively, helped to create the condition and attitude that went in the making of the most successful slave revolt in history, better known as the Haitian Revolution. This revolt was brought into being by three of the most arresting personalities in Caribbean history: Toussaint Louverture, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, and Henri Christophe. The distinguishing feature of this revolution is in the fact that it achieved what the others were not able to achieve: nationhood. The dramatic beginning of the Haitian Revolution is told in the following statement, taken from the book Great Negroes, Past and Present by Russell L. Adams. In 1969, he says, in 1630, the French came to the island and took control of the western side of St. Dominique. With the sweat of the blacks, they made their territory the richest European colonial possession, sending to France a steady stream of sugar, cotton, and indigo. By the end of the 17th century, some 20,000 Frenchmen, 50,000 mulattoes, and 2 million blacks lived there in an uneasy balance. Caste and class separated the three groups. Complicating these divisions was the presence of the Spanish rule on the eastern half of the island. High, well-nigh impassable mountains sliced St. Dominique in two parts. By the way, did y'all hear they are talking about putting up an electric fence between Haiti and the Spanish side there? While France itself was astir with talk of the rights of man and of freedom, equality, and fraternity, autocratic governors generals held absolute sway over thousands of slaves who produced the wealth of St. Dominique and over dissatisfied mulattoes who could own land but had no political or social standing. When the Bastille fell in 1789, the island trembled as though in anticipation of some dreaded catastrophe. In this same year, the mulattoes revolted. France then loosened its rule a bit and allowed the mulattoes to have seats in the new colonial assembly. The mulatto problem. But the enslavement of the blacks continued, harsh and cruel as ever. As the revolution in France gained momentum, the faraway island of St. Dominique became increasingly restless. The blacks became fired with the desire for freedom, and deep in the forest at night they gathered and plotted. The tom-tom language of the Africans told the blacks of the planned uprising. On August 1st, 1789, in the late night hours, Boukman, a voodoo priest whose name and reputed deeds struck terror in the hearts of slaves, held a meeting of leaders. Among them was Pierre Domingue Toussaint, known for his wisdom and respected for his learning. That night, the conspirators plotted their revolt. 8 days later, the entire 2,000 miles of French territory reverberated to the rhythm of hundreds of drums. The whites were terrified. With a mad sweep, the blacks moved from village to village, putting the torch to everything that would burn and killing every white encountered. For weeks, the sky glowed with the flames. More than 6,000 coffee plantations and 200 sugar refineries went up in smoke. The French rallied their forces and finally routed the slaves. Boukman, leader of the revolt, was captured at Cap Francois and his head was impaled on a pole to put fear in the hearts of the slaves. Toussaint succeeded Boukman as leader of the slaves and sought an honorable peace for the blacks who had taken refuge in the forest. At the same time, across the ocean, France had declared war on Spain and England. Thus, the French and Spanish halves of Saint Dominique were at war, following the Arab dictum that he who is the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Toussaint collected his forces and joined the Spaniards in war against the French army. Second in command to Toussaint was Jacques Dessalines, a homely African who had been brought to the island as a young slave but was virtually free because his master feared him. The Spaniards equipped the slave rebels and they began attacking the French from the northern and eastern portion of the island. Aided by the Spanish, Toussaint drove the French forces from the area. France sent 3,000 soldiers to subdue Toussaint and his black Spartans, but they were soon overcome by the forces of Toussaint or the fever which spread through the island. Recognizing that it was helpless to control the revolt, France proclaimed an end to slavery. You know, I should finish reading this, but I'll say this too. You know, this is why sometimes I do agree that you have to fight. You have to fight just because. Sometimes, like, I think it's Mr. Untouchable who talks about it on Shoot the Breeze sometimes. Like, you know, some judge or something is on some racial shit. Sometimes you just have to put up the fight. You know, sometimes you just have to do it, and perhaps it will tip a scale, if not now, later. You know, sometimes you have to do some of these things, right? To continue, Toussaint was not satisfied with the proclamation. He abandoned his Spanish allies and fought his way through the French territory, routing the enemy in town after town. His victories won for him the nickname of L'Ouverture, which means the opener, and the title of General of Saint Domingue for life. All of the blacks praised him, and when he conquered Cap Francois, called him the Deliverer. It was here that he was joined by Henri Christophe, a slave who was born in Grenada in 1767. Pan-Africanism? As a mere boy, Henri worked as a mason and later was brought by a Negro master who operated an inn where Christophe served as a waiter. In the army of L'Ouverture, Henri used his native ability to promote himself to the rank of sergeant in short order. After conquering all of the French territory, Toussaint established himself as Governor General of Saint Domingue. Jacques Dessalines, his comrade in arms, was made governor of the province. Henri Christophe was promoted to the rank of general and made governor of Cap Francois. To the south of Cap Francois, there was a region that was predominantly inhabited by mulattoes. This region was ruled over by Alexander Sabès Pétion. Before Toussaint had time to pull the country together, the mulatto problem that had been somewhat latent during the revolution surfaced and added new problems to Toussaint Louverture's nation-building efforts. While Toussaint was turning his attention to the arts of peace and nation-building, Emperor Napoleon, to the contrary, was planning the reconquest of Haiti. To this effect, Napoleon spared nothing. He ordered 86 ships to be built to carry 22,000 fighting men. The commander of this navy was General Leclerc. This fleet arrived in the waters of Saint Domingue in February 1802. The main force of the fleet was directed at Cap Francois. then under the governorship of Henri Christophe, who refused to receive Leclerc. This led to an attack by the French forces. Christophe put a torch to the city, including his fabulous palace, and fled to the hills. Belatedly, the peasants rushed to join Christophe. General Leclerc had attempted to re-enslave the blacks and return all plantations to their former owners. When this tactic failed, he reversed himself and declared all blacks free forever. He offered Christophe and Dessalines generalships in the French army. He went through the motions of retiring the aged Toussaint with honor. This was part of an overall scheme to destroy the three main leaders of Haiti. Toussaint was captured and taken to France, where he died in prison in 1803. An attempt was made to assassinate Dessalines. This act of deception by Leclerc started another revolution. Christophe and Dessalines joined forces and drove the French army into the sea. In this crisis, the mulattoes put aside their loyalty to the French and fought with the blacks. Dessalines came to power. After his assassination in 1806, Christophe literally rebuilt Haiti and ruled it until his death on October 8, 1820. Revolts against slavery and the colonial system lasted throughout the whole of the 19th century. There were two more revolts after the British took over Guyana from the Dutch in 1808 and 1823. In other British-controlled territories, there were revolts in Jamaica in 1824 and 1831, in Barbados in 1816, and Antigua in 1831. Puerto Rico and Cuba, then still under Spanish rule, had revolts in 1824, 1844, 1868. In the 9-year period between 1828 to 1837, there were again large uprisings in Brazil. These 19th century revolts created the embryo of the concept that in the 20th century became Pan-Africanism. Nice punctuation to that paper. Hope you guys enjoyed that. Hope you guys enjoyed that paper. Pro-Black Perspective says Dessalines homely. What that mean? I mean Dessalines was ugly. Pro-Black Perspective says that's weird. I heard Toussaint didn't join the movement but a few months later. I read about this. I don't remember now. I'll have to look it up. Daily Affirmations by Pauline is here saying good evening. Good evening, Daily Affirmations by Pauline. Make sure you guys check out her book that she just dropped. Follow her YouTube channel and follow her on Facebook and Twitter as well. KW Dawn 7 is here saying Sawubona. Peace to KW Dawn 7. Yeah, that's the paper. Hope you guys got something out of it. If you want me to look up and try to find more writings on revolutions and uprisings in the Black world, in the Black equals African world, you let me know down in the comment section. I'll gladly pull those up. I'll be back on Thursday on the KWAZ radio YouTube channel. You guys should join me over there. Subscribe if you haven't already. And let me know if you're liking those shows over there too, by the way. Right? Anyway, until Thursday, you guys be good. And until next time, peace.
Thanks for listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast with your host, Koku. If you like what you just heard, we hope you pass along our web address, bittermedicineblogs.com, to your friends and colleagues, and share our show to all your social media. Be sure to check out our archive section on our website for previous podcasts. This has been a KWAZ radio production. Join us next time for another session of the Bitter Medicine Podcast. Follow us on Facebook at Bitter Medicine Show, Twitter, Bitter Meds, Tumblr, Bitter Meds, Instagram, Bitter Medicine.